Hello and welcome to all our participants. Thank you for joining us for this exclusive webinar opportunity. I'm Caitlin Salvaria, President of the International Corrugated Packaging Foundation. I'm excited to connect with you today as we share an in-depth look at our industry's sustainability story and the impact a career in corrugated can have on the long-term health of our planet. ICPF's overarching goal is to grow the workforce of the corrugated packaging industry now and into the future. We provide career and recruitment resources, industry knowledge, and partnership opportunities between students and the corrugated packaging industry. And we are proudly co-sponsored by two industry associations, the Fibre Association and AICC, the Independent Packaging Association. Before we wrap up today's presentation, we'll share some opportunities for you to connect with ICPF online and on social media as a resource in your academic journey and eventual career search. So please consider leveraging ICPF as you look for your next step in finding rewarding jobs and lifelong careers. But now I'd like to introduce today's guest speaker, Rachel Kenyon. Rachel is Senior Vice President of the Fibre Association, a nonprofit trade association representing North American manufacturers of corrugated packaging. Rachel's primary responsibilities include the association's communications, marketing, and member relations. Rachel is also President and CEO of the International Corrugated Case Association. She is a former board member of ICPF and a proud Spartan graduate of Michigan State University. Thanks for joining us today, Rachel.
Thanks, Caitlin. So as we get started today, I'm going to talk about the life cycle assessment that was recently completed for the U.S. corrugated packaging industry. But before I do that, I'd like to give a little bit of background about the U.S. corrugated packaging industry. So the U.S. corrugated packaging industry is very large. There are over 1,000 plants in 49 states. There are about 100,000 employees that operate these facilities in nearly 1,000 cities and towns across the U.S. And last year in 2022, shipments were about 401 billion square feet. Data for 2023 will be available later this spring, but this gives you a sense of how large the industry is. And we also have a $43 billion value to our shipments. You switch to the next slide, please. So the Corrugated Packaging Alliance, which sponsored the research that we're going to talk about today, is a jointly sponsored group by the American Forest and Paper Association, the Fibre Association, which I represent, the AICC, which is the Independent Packaging Association, and TAPI, which is the Technical Association of the Pulp and Paper Industry. The mission of this group is to foster growth and profitability of corrugated in applications where it can be demonstrated based on credible and persuasive evidence that corrugated should be the packaging material of choice, and to provide a coordinated industry focus that effectively acts on industry matters that cannot be accomplished by individual members. So the members of these organizations are the member companies of each one of these trade associations, and together we work to ensure that we have one voice for the industry. Next slide, please. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about a life cycle assessment that we recently completed. We're going to talk about the results of that study and also what that study tells us about circularity, and then focus on any questions and answers that you might have. So to begin with, what is a life cycle assessment? The way that we look at a life cycle assessment is to say that a life cycle assessment is a globally accepted methodology used to estimate impacts, and that's important. So we are estimating the impacts to both land, air, and water based on our raw material extraction from the earth, manufacturing of those materials into products, the distribution and use of those materials, along with the transportation of those products, and then the product end of life. So for this life cycle assessment, we looked at corrugated boxes. And again, as we start at the raw material end of things, we look at managed forests that create our products, so our renewable raw materials, which are trees. We look at how those trees pass through to the paper mills, which then break them down, create pulp and paper, and then send them on to converting facilities, which make them into boxes and other forms of packaging. We looked at transportation, and then of course the disposal or end of life. And in this instance for boxes, because we are so highly recycled, that is recycling that material, bringing it back into our stream to create the circle of manufacturing. The data for the life cycle assessment is very representative of our industry. If you look at these two maps that are on this slide, you'll see a representation of those mills and then also the box plants. This, I know, looks like there's a little bit of a area in the middle of the country that we don't cover, and that's really because there aren't any facilities, particularly on the paper mill side. Most of them are on the coast, on the west coast, and then really moving sort of east from the Mississippi. So this is very representative of the facilities that were included. And the same is true for the box plants. The system boundary for the study, again, as we think about what a life cycle does, you'll see on the left-hand side of the slide, it's the raw materials. So what was included in terms of raw materials, energy, chemicals, those kinds of things were all included in addition to the fiber. Then we looked at pulp and paper making operations. If you switch over to the middle, those converting operations, the use again, and end of life, just reiterating all the things that we've talked about that are important in a life cycle assessment. And what this study then gives us is releases to the air, releases to water, and releases to soil. And then you'll also see on the right-hand side of this slide, other uses of OCC. So we recognize in the study that others help us to generate the outcomes that we have from this LCA. So we recognize that materials are exported and that others use those materials. So that's part of the study too, but outside of the system boundary. Here we are with the top line results, and this is the important part. The corrugated packaging industry has really substantially reduced its environmental impact since 2006. 2006 was a baseline year for us. It was the first time we ever did a life cycle assessment. We've done this is the fourth update since 2006. They happen about every 4 years. And what we find, if you look on the very left-hand side, the biggest improvement was in greenhouse gas emissions. So we have dropped the per unit greenhouse gas emissions of making a corrugated box by 50% since 2006. And then you can see the other impacts as we move to the right. So ozone depletion, we've gone down by 13%. Smog, we've reduced our impact by 44%. Acid rain by 41%. Eutrophication by 30%. And eutrophication is, it's a water related impact, and eutrophication is something that leads to algae blooms and dead zones in water. So if you're wondering what that is, that's what that tells you. Respiratory effects, we've dropped by 54%, energy usage by 13%, water usage by 18%. And then you see at the very end on the right-hand side, the only place where we've gone up over that 14-year time period is in fossil fuel extraction. And the reason why we've gone up in that area is because if you look at that and you look at energy usage, those two combined, we've dropped our energy usage by 13%. We've also switched our energy usage from coal and fossil fuels that are more impactful to natural gas, which is the cleaner burning. What fossil fuel extraction looks at is, even though we've switched to a cleaner burning fossil fuel in natural gas is harder to extract from the earth, and that's the measurement there. It's easier to get coal out of the ground, it's easier to get oil out of the ground than it is to get natural gas. So you can see, because we're using that cleaner fuel, this is the only area where we've gone up in our impact. So what are the key drivers of this progress? Again, I mentioned energy improvements. I talked about that shift to cleaner burning fuel, which would be natural gas. We've also increased our participation in a greener U.S. electric grid. So since 2006, the United States has invested in cleaner energy and a cleaner electric grid, and we've taken advantage of that and made use of that cleaner electric grid. We've also generated great energy efficiencies with investments in our industry. Managed forests play a big role in this. So managed forests take CO2 out of the environment, and the efficiency of forests, because more forests are managed versus just left to nature, there's efficiency in those forests. Recycling infrastructure, we have a 3-year OCC average which is old corrugated containers, and that would be a recycling rate of 90.5% from 2019 to 2021. And I'll actually mention that our recovery rate, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, has actually been hovering right around 90% for the last decade. We've also decreased the CO2 and methane emissions because we're not sending things to landfills. And we exported OCC, which is used by other container board producers. So again, if you think about that system boundary that I shared with you earlier, we're exporting to areas of the world where it's going to be used to make boxes again, places like Europe and Asia and other parts of the world. And our commitments to progress are really tracked by the American Forest and Paper Association, particularly on the mill side, through their Better Practices, Better Planet 2030 sustainability goals. So the industry has set goals that they strive to achieve and have really met many of the goals. The first iteration of Better Practices, Better Planet had goals for 2020. They exceeded those goals and set new goals for 2030, and those are in place today. If we look at the individual impact categories, again, if you look at greenhouse gases, this is where we've seen the most significant drop in improvement that we've made. So again, the corrugated industry has reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in that 14-year time period from 2006 to 2020. The CO2 removals are primarily from trees grown to produce container board. So if you think about it, one of the things people say is, we don't like cutting down trees. Trees that are grown for container board are really a crop, and they're grown to become container board. They are not our national forests. They are not stands of trees that are just there. They think about them as being part of a farmer's crop. So the farmers in this instance are tree farmers. And so they're growing a crop that they know will harvest, but that means too that they're also replanting. So they want to be able to sustain their crop so that they can live off of that crop. And so they're replanting each time. So if you look at this, the CO2 removals from trees grown to produce container board are equivalent to 83% of all 2020 emissions. Our 3-year average, again, I mentioned, was OCC recovery rate was about 90.5, leading to reduced CO2 and methane emissions from fewer boxes and landfills. And again, we participated in a greener US electric grid. On the air side of things, our reductions, again, this is just highlighting what those air-related indicators are. We talked about ozone depletion, smog, respiratory effects, acid rain. Again, all of the drivers behind these were things like a reduction in emissions and particulates from containerboard mills. So there's not a lot of dust and particles that are flying around that might inhibit respiratory or create respiratory problems for people. And again, we're using a cleaner burning fuel that I talked about, which primarily is natural gas. On the water side of things, I talked about what eutrophication is, but really it's that nutrient discharge has gone down by 30%. So we're not putting things into the water that could create problems for the life that lives in that body of water. Our water usage in total has gone down by 18%, and our water consumption by 26%. And I want to make sort of a little distinction here between water usage and water consumption. We use water in the manufacturing process, but we also treat that water and return that water. So our actual water consumption is actually not as great as our water usage, because what is consumed is very small compared to the water that we squeeze out of the paper when we make it, and we return that, we treat that water and we return it to the system. And just a note here that there was no comparison for the water consumption in 2006. We did not measure that at that time. So really, at the end of the day, what we've found is that to achieve this progress takes a combination of both new and fresh fibers, and recycled fibers, to maximize fiber usage and enable circularity. And I think that's a really important point to make, that we need both in our products. stream. So people might say, why not use only recycled content? Why not use any virgin? At some point, that fiber does break down. It has, it's harder to connect with each other. So we do need an influx of some fresh fiber along the way to keep us moving. And that introduction of fiber helps us with the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, because again, we're looking at those trees to help us on the front end of this. And then the use of OCC contributes to the avoidance of CO2 and methane if you were to put our product in the landfill. So really, circularity drives all of this. And I think that's an important point to make, because there are many industries that are working today to move from a linear manufacturing model to a circular model. And so if we talk about circularity, and this just gives you a little schematic of what happens starting from number 1 over here, which shows the trees in the forest, and then moving through some of the manufacturing processes, and then looping back around to collect that material and reprocess that material to make new products. So corrugated products are really advancing a circular value chain, and they can be used to look at as a model for other materials that are looking at moving from that linear manufacturing model, which is that traditional sort of take, make, and waste model, to circularity. So if we look at the front end, again, I talked about how important and that really this LCA proves out the fact that we need both a front end that draws raw materials that are renewable, and then a back end that is able to recycle those materials to make new products. If we look strictly at the front end of renewable resources, again, these are trees. And I've got some facts here just to reiterate sort of, you know, the idea that we're really not running out of forest land, that really net forest area in the United States has increased by approximately 18 million acres over the last 30 years or so. And this is equivalent to approximately 1,200 NFL football fields every day. US forest land totals around 766 million acres. And each year, US forests grow approximately 2 times more tree volume than is harvested. Tree cuttings and removals occur on less than 2% of forest lands each year. And that really contrasts with, if you think about it, we lose about 3% of our forests to natural events like insects or disease or fire. On the back end of this, we talked about the front end and the renewable resource. On the back end, I mentioned recycling early, but just to give you a visual of what that recycling rate looks like. In the study, we used a recycling rate of 90.5, and that was a 3-year average between 2019 and 2021. But if you look at 2022, our OCC recycling rate was 93.6. And if you go back in time, again, this is where you'll see that we've hovered right around that 90% for the last decade, which I think speaks volumes for the corrugated industry. What new products, if you wanted to, you know, ask what new products are made with this recycled fiber. So again, we put 54% of it back into containerboard when we recycle, and that's the paper that's used to make new boxes. But then recycled material also goes into other products like boxboard, tissue, and other paper products that that use that material. That's 15%. And then again, a large piece of this is net exports. 31% goes to other countries for them to make boxes. So in wrapping all of this up, if you're looking for an industry that cares about sustainability, one that has been committed to sustainability for really quite a long time, and you're looking for careers, you know, green jobs, I would say work for an industry that prioritizes sustainability and consider a career in corrugated. There's a lot of jobs that are available that can match your interests and give you exciting challenges along the way. And we've got many of those jobs listed here on this slide. And now I'll open it up to questions and answers. So if you have a question, I believe we're using the chat to take care of questions and answers today. So please feel free to drop a question in the chat.
Yeah, you can also raise your hand if you want to.
So the first question was the LCA conducted by ISO 140 standards. Yes, it was. Actually, it was conducted 140 and I believe 10. There's one other. So I don't want to misquote which one it was, but I think it's like 144 or something close to that. Other questions? Did the emissions reduction of 50% account for scope 1 to 3? It actually, yes, it did. So one of the things, a follow-up to the life cycle assessment, is that we had box users, so customers of ours who came back to us and said, it would really be helpful if we had some way of using this information to estimate our scope 3 emissions. So people who use boxes for them are scope 3 emissions. And what we've done is we've created a calculation tool. So we're getting ready to roll out that calculation tool in January so that we can help our customers determine what the impact is for the packaging that they use. Let's see. I think there's one more question. Okay, let's see. What was the LCA tool that was used? The LCA tool was conducted by two organizations, NACASI, which is the National Association for Air and Stream Improvements, conducted with antithesis. So it's the model that they used. And again, both of those organizations worked with us back in 2006. So they've had a model that they've been able to then update 4 times now to get to our 2020 data. And then also the outcomes or the results of the LCA work that we did has been entered in the US LCI database so that users have the most up-to-date information about our products. Let's see.
The follow-up too was how to attain a copy of the LCA.
So you can obtain a copy of the LCA by visiting the Fibre Box Association website. And I think we should have put that, maybe a link to that on here. But you can get, not only can you get the full report, but you can get an executive summary. There is a infographic available, some slides that are fairly similar to these slides that people can use to talk about the LCA, and a few other materials that are available there. And maybe at the end of this, we'll make sure that it gets sent out to the participants of this event.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is a little bit longer question. I apologize, it's taking me a minute to read, but it says, is there any data on biodiversity impact of the corrugated industry? I know can be hard to quantify, but curious if this is being tracked, especially with the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures in Development. So one of the things that this study didn't particularly look at that, but many of the projects that we work on does look at the biodiversity of the forest. And that's something that is part of sustainable forestry management. So all of, most of the companies, and I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's something like 96% or 98% of companies that are part of the American Forest and Paper Association adheres to Sustainable Forestry Initiative standards, in which that SFI includes standards for biodiversity. So making sure that when you're managing a forest, you're allowing for that biodiversity of not only plant species, but obviously of animal species as well in that environment.
There's another question on the transportation side. What are future steps?
So on the transportation side, I'm wondering, is it the transportation of boxes that you're looking at, or is it, I guess I need a little bit more clarification there, but really what we looked at in terms of transportation was the transportation it took throughout the system, through the value chain to get the product to the user and then back to recycling. So that's one thing that's very important and differentiates corrugated from things like returnable plastic containers, who have many more transportation legs. The other thing I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion was that there are 1,152 corrugated box facilities. The reason there are so many box facilities in the US is because they serve a fairly small radius around them. Many of them can ship because those capabilities are available, and if they're cost efficient, they will do that. They might ship to a different state, but most of the time, a corrugated box facility is located next to a hub of manufacturing. So for instance, there's quite a few facilities in the Chicago area where I live, because there's a lot of food manufacturing in the Chicagoland area. So that's just an example. But certainly transportation was part of the calculations.
Thank you. I saw one other question come in. How do you consider PCR in your system boundary for the LCA? Because you can also recycle it. So how is your data analyzed to avoid double dipping?
So I believe you're talking about post-consumer recycled product. There isn't necessarily a differentiation between post-consumer recycled. It's really how much is produced and then what is consumed in the box plants. So box plants, for instance, produce any waste that they have goes back into the recycling system. So today, most of what does get recycled comes from commercial sources. So one of the things that's hard to track, and something that we're hoping to change and help encourage behavior on, is residential recycling. Consumers have a choice to recycle or to put things in their trash bin. We hope that consumers choose to recycle, because we really do use that fiber again. I know there's been a lot of skepticism about recycling, and people are concerned about things that they put in their bin not always being recycled. But I will tell you that from a corrugated box perspective, from a cardboard box perspective, it absolutely 100% is being recycled. And that bears true in our numbers and our recovery rate.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I think that was the last question that we have. So really quickly, if you turn your attention to the final slide, you'll see a QR code that can be used to access all ICPF social media channels. So please consider using this code to follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, X, Facebook, and YouTube to stay up to date on industry news, career internship opportunities, and more. You can also visit our website at www.careersandcorrugated.com. You can also visit, as Rachel mentioned, the Fibre Box Association website to get more specific information on the LCA at www.fibrebox.org. You can also reach out to ICPF directly to connect with us, find box plants in your area, post your resume on our free career portal, or simply learn more about all that corrugated packaging has to offer. Thanks so much for your time today, everyone. Take care.